It's back!
I heard, Peter. I heard.
Kids, it's happening. Get your coats. This is what we practiced for.
Yeah! I love you, Dad.
I love you too, sweetheart. None of the past matters.
It has been 9 months since I last covered Inverness Caledonian Thistle. At the time, they had just been put into administration and looking set for back-to-back relegations. There were still questions over who would actually be willing to buy the club, and if there would actually be a club to support in the future. Well, these last 9 months have actually been somewhat kind to Inverness, and seeing as it would only be fair, let's go over these last 9 months, and this time, for good, end the series on a positive note. When Inverness went into administration, one of the big changes was the departure of Duncan Ferguson. He was replaced by first team coach Scott Kelleher, who is both a local and former player. This wouldn't be the first time he would be manager, as he was interim back in 2013, but this would be his first proper job. At this point, there were no expectations for him, but an ultimate goal of not finishing bottom was somewhat doable. His first 2 games would see Inverness lose once again to Dumbarton before Scott's first home game would see a 1-1 draw with Kelty Hearts. The 4th of November would see a club statement in regards to parties interested in buying the club, in which they announced they had received expressions of interest from 20 different parties. BDO, the administrators, also confirmed that all funds being raised via donations and the GoFundMe were going towards running the club and not towards paying debts. The next 2 games would see Inverness win for the first time under Scott Kelleher, and also the first time away from home after a 2-1 win at Cove Rangers. This would be followed by Kelleher's first home win with a 1-0 victory over Alloa. A big blow would be dealt off the pitch during this week, however, as the planned Battery Farm would have its appeal rejected by the Scottish Government, with it being denied due to loss of green space, excess noise, and the visual impact the development would have. Right, time to put my university stuff to good use. I do wonder what the balance of policies is when it comes to these sorts of decisions. The Scottish Government has this document called the National Planning Framework, which has sections relating to energy, where it does say development proposals for all forms of renewable, low carbon and zero emissions technologies will be supported, including battery storage. Although it does have a bunch of aspects that must be mitigated for these projects, which makes me question how bad this proposal was written up and planned out. Anyway, back to the football. Cali would finish November with a Scottish Cup third round tie, which would see them face Cove Rangers. Getting to the 4th round could see the club given a glamour tie away to Celtic or Rangers, which could provide much needed funds to the club. Even then, there is the extra prize money on offer, which would be handy. They would lose 2-0. Seeing that, Scott Kelleher did win Manager of the Month, so fair play to him. I'm sure Duncan Ferguson was happy to see that come through. December would see more improvements on the pitch, as Cali would beat 10-man Montrose and Stinnosmuir away from home, but their games in Inverness would see defeats to Arbroath and Cove. Companies House, meanwhile, would unveil the list of debts the club owed to different companies. Of the 135 debtors, this included Dundee FC with £4,000 owed, Football Safety Officers Association being owed £1,200, HMRC owed £150,000, that's not one you want to have, Red Poppy Restaurant were owed £26,000, Scottish Gas owed £750, somebody left the hob on apparently, the SFA £700, Scottish Police Authority £2,500, Scott Gardner £70,000, David Cameron, no, not the former Prime Minister who liked pigs a bit too much, a former director, £410,000, Alan Munro £660,000, Ross Morrison £1.65 million, and O2 Mobile a whopping £1.62. Their debts at the time were totaled up to be £3,771,971.64, which is less than ideal to say the least. A week later, Allan Savage would confirm with BDO that there were still 15 parties interested in buying the club, but there were issues surrounding the ownership of land, including the car park. The car park at the Caledonian Stadium is under lease to Propco, which is a company that Morrison and Cameron are involved with. How the rest of the land is owned, however, is that the stadium and its surroundings are owned by Highland Council, but the club has a lease on the stadium until 2094. And only the stadium. This means the club can't use the surrounding land to create extra revenue, which, considering their location, is a bit of an issue. January would start off with a 2-0 win against Dumbarton, but there would once again be more off-pitch drama, this time involving SFA licences. Oh god, I have to talk about this again, don't I? Inverness had their SFA licence downgraded to an entry licence due to entering administration. Not for first team reasons like Hamilton, Bonnyrigg or Bucky, which carried points deductions or an inability to enter the SPFL. With this downgrade of a licence, there were concerns about Inverness being kicked out of the league, but that evidently hasn't happened. The following day, however, it was revealed by BDO that proposals regarding agreements surrounding club debts had been agreed. Back on the pitch, however, Inverness would follow their victory over Dumbarton with a 3-0 win away at Annan, a 3-2 defeat to Queen of the South, and a 2-1 win away at Alloa, greatly boosting their survival hopes. Also, remember that GoFundMe? Well, someone donated £20,000 towards it, so fair play to whoever that was, as this donation was anonymous. February started with another win, this time at home against Queen of the South. There would be a shake-up at the boardroom level, however, but for once it's actually something positive, as the Supporters Trust would be given a seat at the table, allowing for greater transparency between those running the club and the fans. Interim CEO Charlie Christie, meanwhile, would give an update in regards to finding investors. The club were down to a final shortlist of 3 or 4 potential buyers, and these buyers were legitimate business people and not Ketan Makwana style weirdos. He also stated his belief that if a new buyer is found soon, they could be back in the Premiership rather quickly. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, lads. A bit of money would enter the club as newly poker player owned Dunfermline would sign Keith Bray for an undisclosed fee, although this would be a fee and not for nothing, unlike the deal to sell Cameron Harper to Carlisle. February would close with a 3-0 defeat to Arbroath and a 1-0 win away at Kelty. March would open with a 1-1 draw at home against Montrose before we would get another update, this time from Allan Savage. He came out saying that the land issues were resolved and that there was hope a buyer would be sorted for the end of April. He also confirmed that the club would be looking to keep as much of the current team around as possible for next season, along with him staying as a director if need be. This news would be followed by back-to-back wins over Dumbarton and Sedlesmere, which saw the club jump up to 8th, seeing them outside of the relegation playoffs. This good news, however, would not last, as the initial deadline of the 6th of March to find a buyer would come and go with nobody putting a formal bid in. It was revealed by BDO that there were multiple concerns surrounding the club, including the debts the club owed, the way the shares are split up, and the land ownership around the stadium. Again. The joint administrators, meanwhile, were looking at getting the loans owed by the club written off, while Savage was willing to extend his financial support. This financial support from Savage would involve paying 25% of the purchasing fee along with funding the following 2 seasons. Although later that day, Savage would come out and say he had run out of money, but there would be a crunch day meeting coming up with the many shareholders and creditors. The following day, a spokesperson for one of the major creditors came out saying they would forgive the debt owed if it would help the club survive, giving fans hope that there is still a chance of survival. Charlie Christie would put out a further plea for those in the Inverness area to come together to do whatever it takes to save the club. The 19th of March would see a meeting between shareholders that would be described as being very positive, once again giving hope to the fans. The final piece of news from this day and one of interest was the idea from Savage that Inverness should move to a new stadium, suggesting the Caledonian Stadium is too big and too costly to run. It is also in a terrible location, separated from a city centre by a large industrial estate and the A9, which, when compared to the old grounds being in more residential areas, does affect the ability to draw in fans. While Savage hasn't decided on a site, there are multiple likely sites in the city, which Scotch and Scarves covers in more detail, so give that a watch. I'll leave a link to it in the description. On the pitch was also proving to be a bit of a mess, with defeats to Annan and Queen of the South sandwiching a draw with Alloa, but good news would arrive at the end of the month. A club statement revealed a deal had been struck with loan creditors, major shareholders, and a former director over the writing off of debts and the returning of shares to the club, making a potential sale of the club much easier. The following day, a buyer would put in a bid of £800,000 for the club. Allan Savage. Yes, the man who has been keeping the club afloat for most of the season has decided he can't be bothered waiting for another buyer and has decided to do it himself, with his demands being 100% of shares, all loans and debts written off, and the land around the stadium. Savage's plan for the club was to become a sustainable mid-table championship club before looking at becoming a premiership club, which is the sort of sensible thinking the club has very much been missing these last few years. As April came then, with a win away against Cove happening on the pitch, on the 10th it was revealed that yes, Allan Savage had his deal accepted by BDO, with those issues previously mentioned being resolved. This meant that Inverness were almost certainly safe from liquidation. During this time, I feel like we should look at some old faces. Remember 77 Ventures? That weird consultancy firm set up by Ketan Makwana who were looking to buy the club back in August, despite having negative money. Well, they have grown a bit and added more business people to their experts section on their website. Scott Gardner. Anyway, following the news he would be buying the club, Savage announced that Orion Group, his main company, would be injecting £600,000 into the club, along with aiming at promotion back to the Championship. This is something they could start planning for, as after a draw away at Stenhousemuir, a 3-0 win at home against possibly still hungover champions Arbroath guaranteed survival on the pitch, something which back in October seemed unthinkable. May would come around and so would the end of the season. The final day would see Inverness go out with a 2-0 win away at Montrose, which meant they actually finished 7th and ahead of their opponents on the day. Also, if you take away their points reduction, they would have finished 2nd just ahead of Cove. Even then, if we take the season based on when Scott Kelleher took charge, they were the 2nd best team in the division, despite the fact they were playing a lot of academy players and with the departures of many players due to administration. Of course, this calls into question the abilities of a former manager who decided in his book to slag off the club and its fans. Yes, Duncan Ferguson has released a book, and in it he talks about his time at Inverness. In his book, he seemingly blames everyone but himself, bigs himself up for not losing games, ignoring that he barely won games, let alone scored goals, something he had the worst record at in both the Championship and League One, and that in the summer when contracts were being ignored and players had no idea what the future held, he was sunning it up in Florida. This man wants to get back into management, by the way. To any club officials who are watching this video, I know the Aki's board watch them, don't hire this man. He is clearly not a very good manager. Speaking of managers, Savage confirmed that for next season, Scott Kelleher would remain in charge following his successful stint, so it will be interesting to see how that pans out. Personally, I think he should have been given Manager of the Year for the SPFL. He's certainly done a more impressive job than actual winner Brendan Rodgers if we're going off of expectations. With a final meeting planned for the 22nd of May to get the deal finalised, Savage reserved a special thanks for those who are part of the Inverness Supporters Trust for backing his bid, saying it was a major boost to the club's survival as the trust had a 10% sharehold in the club. Other positive news include the writing off of Ross Morrison's £1.5 million loan, meaning that the total the club owes will be down to just under £2 million versus the nearly £4 million it was at the beginning of the season. This has made it incredibly more likely that a company voluntary arrangement will happen, seeing the club exit administration. The club were also able to agree deals with 11 players for next season, including Billy Mackay, Danny DeVete and Louis Longstaff, but there would be more delays to the CVA meeting, seeing it delayed to June 5th. This was due to the need of a legal agreement involving the club, current leaseholders and Highland Council over the ownership of stadium land. Savage, however, confirmed that 95% of shareholders have agreed to cede their shares to him, meaning that the deal was almost complete. In the meantime, plans were drawn up to forge a link with Brighton to use Tony Bloom's Jamestown analytics to help with recruitment. Not sure how this will work with Bloom set to take a 29% stake in Hearts, but it's worth a shot I suppose. Savage also announced that Nessie and Nessa, the club's mascots, will be making a return, along with plans to build a cafe at the stadium as part of the NC 500 route, along with general stadium improvements. The wrongs of the past were also righted, with £30,000 being spent to help players with injuries. Unlike what happened with Aaron Dorrans last summer, where he had to crowdfund his injury recovery plan. June would arrive and on the 5th there was a club announcement. The joint administrators held meetings involving creditors and members to consider the company voluntary arrangement proposals, which were based upon the offer for the club submitted by Allan Savage. The joint administrators are delighted to advise that both meetings approved the CVA. This will allow the club to exit administration and retain its place in League One of the Scottish Football Leagues.
What that means is that effectively brings the administration process to an end. The club will now operate under a voluntary arrangement for a period that we expect to last.
They've done it. Inverness Caledonian Thistle have survived. The deal will be completed in early July, just in time for when they play the League Cup group stages where they face Raith Rovers. That's fun. The club can also start preparing properly for the season, as when the takeover is done, they can start registering new players. Fans can rejoice as their club will continue, and with the plans Savage has outlined, an exciting future lay in place for the Highland club. Ross County are currently playing in the Championship, so it could be possible that these two clubs play each other this season in the Cups, or next season in the league, depending on how each club does. And a year after the first video where I detailed their initial fall, then the shenanigans with Ketan Makwana, and then entering administration, I can finally say I have a happy ending for an Inverness video. They are free from being milked for content, but I'm also free from Inverness. Wait. I'm free.
You know, when I started this series, it was a case of just your typical, that club's doing shite. It's a good laugh, you know. It's like, Raith have had a terrible record against Inverness, so it's a good chance for me to laugh at them. But, you know, as time has gone on, I've grown a wee bit of a soft spot, you know. It's like if you told me like 2 years ago I'd have grown a soft spot for Inverness, I'd just like, what on earth has happened? But no, it's just like the whole administration story, this keeping yourselves together, you know, it's a bit inspirational, and so I am very happy. I'm very, very happy that Inverness have come out of this on like the right side, and just thank God that he's still got a club, because it's like Raith in the early 2000s went through something similar. We were in a mess. We could have ended up in the situation that Inverness were. So I've got sympathy for that. You know, there's proper people involved in supporting that club. So, administration is something that no club should go through, because it's a fear of losing your club, and it's something that's so important to so many people here in this country. So, to Inverness, thank you. As much as I've enjoyed taking the piss out of you, it's been brilliant to see you come out of this on the other side, and hopefully I don't have to talk about any other clubs going into administration.
But what about Dumbarton?